Welcome to TAC Ops. I'm Greg, better known as Covert Cabal. With me is Eric, as always.
Howdy.
Today we have H I Sutton. He's the author of Covert Shores books, the website. He writes for Jane's, and he's the artist behind some pretty incredible graphics and cutaways. So thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to say something real quick. I'm a huge fan of Sutton's, and I have his recognition guide that is fantastic. I suck. As much as I look at submarines, for whatever reason, I have a really bad problem recognizing them, especially when it comes to Chinese submarines, because there's just so little content to look at and just recognize, and it is great, man. I want to personally thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. Good to be here.
All right, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is, we definitely have a super covert show. We have Covert Cabal and we have Covert Shores on the show. Covert Cabal and I have talked about ourselves enough, and I don't think we really have to cover too much about us. But, Sutton, if you wanted to just give us like a brief introduction of what you do and how you do everything.
Yeah, sure. So, as the intro said, I mainly have a website, Covert Shores, hisutton.com, and it covers submarines, mostly unusual stuff. So it's whether it's history or some of it's really current, but it's always the unusual stuff, the stuff that's not covered very much elsewhere. So if you've got an obscure submarine that no one's heard of, it might be on my website or in my books, and it's the interesting stuff where you have to figure things out and go find stuff out and do some real analysis. Also, mostly midget submarines, special mission submarines, swimmer delivery vehicles, narco subs, all the obscure stuff. And he also said I enjoy doing graphics, sometimes cutaways, but profiles or different illustrations as well. Again, mostly of submarines.
Yeah, those are incredible to look at. I love looking through those, and I think we'll get into that more. But Eric, I think this is mostly going to be your podcast. You'll be taking head on this one since you're our submarine expert. I'm sure you have many questions.
Yeah, definitely. This is going to be a fun one for me. I've always wanted to talk to you, Sutton. I think that there's not just a whole lot of interviews out there with you, and I think this is super fantastic. And so I wanted to get your take on a few things. The first one is just lately they just launched the Belgorod. So Russia's what I'm trying to coin their mothership. You could sit there and call it some kind of like SSBN, whatever, but realistically, it's not going to be a ballistic missile submarine or a guided missile submarine.
There isn't actually a designation for it, right? It doesn't fit SSBN or anything. It's a mix. So I don't know. Maybe NATO will come up with a new designation. It's weird, isn't it? It's unique.
Yeah, I want to coin mothership.
Like a special surface or a special purpose submarine, or
so the designations. So on the one hand, it's a you could say an auxiliary, so an SSAN, which is really rarely used term, but would apply to So you don't find that very much on the internet, but that would apply to all the sort of host or mothership submarines, host submarines that Russia has. And then it also is going to be armed with the torpedoes, the Poseidon torpedo and torpedo. So maybe SSTN, but I don't know that. No one's actually made that official. Poseidon, torpedo is a unique weapon, so there's no designation for a torpedo. Or, all submarines carry torpedoes, but not in the manner that we're talking about here. We're talking about giant torpedoes.
Yeah, definitely more UUVs than torpedoes, because those things can, they can redock with the actual, launching submarine, which makes it really, really unique in its fashion.
And you want to go in real quick. You want to go into UUV. That would be an unmanned underwater vehicle, in case anyone didn't know. So kind of like a drone, but underwater.
Yeah, we can definitely talk about Poseidon. It's I do sort of view it more as a torpedo. It's clearly a weapon, and it's sort of fired in the same, well, shot is a better word, but in the same way you would a torpedo. It doesn't just sort of float around in the oceans waiting to be called to action. It's launched from a submarine on a one-way mission with a warhead, and it's not much use in any other sort of role that other UUVs are being developed for, reconnaissance or mine warfare or whatever. And I don't know if it can dock again, but because it's got virtually unlimited range and it's massive, it's about 24 meters long. Don't know what that is in foot, but it's big. It's sort of it's bigger than most midget submarines, put it that way. So it's invariably called a drone, which is a fair description. I think the US Navy call it an intercontinental autonomous torpedo.
Oh, nice. Okay, so, and it's also, just to explain a little bit to people who haven't heard of the Poseidon Weapon, but it's a nuclear-powered nuclear weapon, and its design is to basically be shot from, almost anywhere realistically. Supposedly, if it's nuclear-powered, you can go all the way around the world with it, but you can shoot it from anywhere, and then its main purpose, there's all kinds of rumors making tsunamis and all this crazy stuff, but the main purpose really is to go and blow up an entire battle group, a naval battle group, which is huge, right? You're talking, that could be, they could be doing a photo X like we did, and you could have 3 carriers next to each other, 2 submarines and 12 auxiliary ships, and it could be crazy, and you could just take them all out in one hit, and that's a quarter of the Navy, with one weapon. And this thing can supposedly mount 6, right, Sutton?
Yeah. Some sources maybe 8, but I think 6 is the right number. Yeah, they're massive. I'd guess about 100 tons. So that's about 30 times the size of a normal torpedo, give or take. And as you say, the Russians say it's multi-role or multi-purpose, so they definitely suggest it can hit a carrier battle group, and if it did, it would be devastating. I think coastal cities are the more obvious target. They don't move because it only goes at torpedo speeds. And even if it was very fast for a torpedo, so even if it, some estimates put it at 100 knots, I think less, but even if it could do 100 knots, it still takes days to get to its target. So trying to hit a carrier battle group with it, I'm not convinced. I think it raises a lot of challenges around guidance and things like that. But if they could use it in that way, yeah, it wins. There's no real defense against a 2 megaton warhead in the middle of a carrier battle group.
Yeah, definitely. One of the game changers that I've been thinking about is, I can't say that we have SOSUS out there or not or whatever, but I'm sure we're listening. And the speeds, there were rumors going around it was super cavitating at one time or whatever, which we know is garbage. You just look at the shape of it and tell it's not. But even going, let's say it goes 80 knots, you start to cavitate when you get, you're going 400, 300 feet and you're coming up next to a shoreline, you're going to start to cavitate real bad. And so they're going to hear that thing coming from miles, literally.
Yeah, I don't think it's built for stealth. And also although it's massive for a torpedo, it's very small for a nuclear submarine. So it's got a pump jet, which is another reason it's not super cavitating, but it's not going to be stealth. So people keep using the word stealth. It's stealthy in the way that submarines are stealthy and inherently stealthy, but it's not particularly stealthy. They're going to hear it coming. But if it's very deep, and if it's used in a classic way, sort of a second strike nuclear weapon, and it's running at 1,000 meters depth, that's about 3,000 feet depth, there's nothing can hit it anyway. So you can hear it coming, but you're just you're listening to something that's going to kill you.
Is there any way of stopping it, or is there any? It's just like a normal torpedo in that respect, right?
I think it will require a new generation of countermeasures, effects. Hard kill countermeasures. So torpedoes, deeper diving. Some Western torpedoes are designed to go very deep, but the performance parameters you're going to need to catch something that's going. So even if it goes only 60 knots, I say only. That's fast. You've got to be ahead of it. You're not going to catch it realistically. If it's at that deep. So yeah, I think a whole new generation of torpedoes will have to be fielded realistically only by the US and UK, I think.
Yeah, the hard kill torpedoes, they're really interesting because they've been trying them out. At least the U.S. Navy's been trying them out, and they're just on and off. They put them on, they try them out, and they're like, nah, they're just not worth it. We got to take them back off, and now they're putting them back on again. I think you're right in that aspect that they're probably a little bit worried about this weapon with it.
I think, having a hard kill. So if you can hit it before it detonates, that's a win, right? Because it's not likely to trigger the nuclear explosion. So yeah, that's definitely good. But having, when I say hard kill torpedo, I'm thinking fired from a submarine or launched from a missile tube on a submarine. And you're hoping to do it a long, long way from your carrier, but it's not a sort of point defense, which is what we've seen on the carriers, that system that was deployed and has been taken out of service very recently. But I think submarines, if you look at the specs for Western submarines, increasingly they've got hard kill defensive weapons, not really against Poseidon, I don't think, just against regular torpedoes. But yeah, I think the new generation of torpedoes will be a lot more like UUVs. They'll have more autonomy. They'll need to operate a long way and for a long time, loiter on their own and have very high performance. And they're probably very big, they're heavyweight torpedoes.
Yeah, it's likely that, you could say the ad cap is pretty much a UUV at this point. I mean, it's just so freaking smart,
But I think electric, they're going that direction and possibly carrying more than one smaller torpedo as a payload, and networks of torpedoes and combined with, sensors on the seabed and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost, you see almost an echo of ICBMs and the whole missile defense and all that stuff that's going on, where they're trying to hard kill them. They're trying to put multiple warheads on there and stuff like that. It's really interesting. It's like they're taking a page from that whole aspect.
Yeah. It's difficult. It's and the fact, what's slightly interesting, if it was, so its obvious use is against cities. So if it's used as a second strike deterrence, then you could argue that it doesn't need to be countered because your deterrent is, retaliation with nuclear weapons.
And that always blows my mind. Just the concept of it's really fun to think about and read about, just the concept of first strike and second strike. So the second strike would be to survive an attack from another country. And the whole purpose of that is to dissuade the country in the first place from attacking you, that no matter what they do, they cannot eliminate all of your ability to retaliate.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of speculation from people, suggesting it's sort of first strike weapon and imagining that it's a stealthy UUV that sort of will float into your port and wait there and inflict a first strike. I don't think it's particularly ideal for that. As you say, it's not like to be stealthy. They're not like to be able to call it back. It's going to take days to get to its target. Which is in a political scenario, that's not, that's a liability. If you've got to be certain that you want to go through with it. So there's lots that doesn't make sense in that regard. But the thing is, they portray it as a multi-role weapon, so it can be used tactically as well, and that means it has to be countered in a sort of tactical scenario. You have to be able to stop it. So I'm not sure why that it doesn't necessarily make it. I'm not sure what the sort of advantage to portraying it as a multi-role weapon is. It seems to create challenges. And similarly, the whole tactical nuclear debate, which is going on at the moment, is again making it more likely that they'll need a counter. If people are more willing to use them and, nuclear weapons, then yeah.
So, and what else? The other problem with using it as a first strike weapon is it's limited to coastline cities too.
Yeah. And terrible news for some coastline cities, but it's not going to decapitate the whole, the ability of an adversary to retaliate.
So what's your thoughts on all the rumors going around about how it will cause these, mile higher, I don't even know what they say, it's always different, tsunamis that will, take out the entire East Coast and stuff like that?
I think they're probably garbage. There are a couple of reasons. So I think And I was guilty when it first was reported. There was, in Russian media, they talked about 100 megaton warhead, and that's big. That's the biggest of anything, and it's plausible from a technical perspective. The Russians could build a warhead that large and put it in a platform like that. But it was just speculation, as far as I can tell, and I'm not certain of this, but I think they just someone made it up somewhere and mixed things up with another weapon called the T-15 torpedo, which was being developed in the 1950s in Russia and related to the Tsar bomb, which was the biggest bomb ever exploded. And it was mixed up there, and people speculated, and the Russians were citing a US scientist who was long since dead. So it's not an opinion they phoned him up for, about cobalt salting. So different ways in which a weapon could be made to be more nasty. But more recently, it's been, the Russian sources are saying 2 megatons, which is a fraction, obviously, of a 100 megaton warhead. And in either case, I don't think tsunamis were really, or not in the sort of to the extreme sense that it was being portrayed. It's very nasty. If it goes off, if you're in New York City, you don't want to be there. It's bad enough. You don't have to make it 100 megatons. You don't have to. One thing interesting, and this is my speculation, so this is just a guess, but if it does 60 knots, they could try to pulse it out of the water and do a very low air burst if they wanted to. That seems plausible. I mean, torpedoes do sometimes have the problem of jumping out of the water. I mean, hopefully fix that when it comes to it accidentally, but it's they've got the speed to do it.
Huh. Are there any other launch platforms that are being planned? Are there any other submarines? So the Belgorod is a Oscar class, a converted Oscar, or no, it was a converted Oscar class. Yeah. So they're planning on putting this on other submarines too?
Yeah, definitely. I think 4 of them. So one of them we know. That is the project. I'll have to, you got me on the spot. I'd have to remember the project number. But it's the, the project 09851 submarine. I want to say Kabrovsk, but I might be saying that so badly that anyone who can speak Russian would, probably vomit. But there's another submarine being built, which is purpose-built from scratch to carry the system. It's probably related to the Boeing class SSBN, so ballistic missile submarine.
Yeah, because these are so big that you need an incredible. It's the size of a SLBM, right?
Well, it's about twice the size.
Twice the size. Wow. Yeah.
So those missiles vary in size, but if you pretty much take 2 of them and end on end, then you have a Poseidon. But if you think a normal ballistic missile submarine carries 16 of them, and this is only carrying 6, right, then actually it's still a smaller submarine than the SSBN. But what's different is instead of the SSBN typically carries its missiles behind the sail, and this will carry the torpedo tubes for Poseidon in front of the sail, so it sort of be a different shape as well, but it will look, I think, a lot like the Boeing. And then there's 2 more submarines, and we can speculate, but they're probably new build, similar to the Boeing again, so just improvements of the 09851 class.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the actual, like, how are they carrying them? So there's been rumors that they're internally carrying them, and they'll have, and I think people are confusing the harpsichord video with the actual Poseidon video, which are 2 totally different things, and the harpsichord's way smaller.
I'm guilty of that.
And I want to. I've heard rumors that they're going to be externally mounted too, which is a huge deal because, now you're talking about attrition on these weapons where, seawater is a killer. It will kill anything that's in it.
Yes. And so the answer is confusing. So it depends how how up you are on submarine sort of jargon. They're going to be carried in tubes. I think we can be pretty confident on that. We've seen pictures of tubes. We know there's another submarine that's really important here, which is called Sarov, which is the test submarine. So that was built about nearly 20 years ago now, and launched, let's say, over 10 years ago. And that's been doing the tests. It can only carry one of them. And it's undoubtedly built to carry a super large torpedo. There's no need to build it if you're just testing normal torpedoes. And it's so it collaborates the story quite well. And so from that we can be pretty sure that it's a tube, and it's nuclear, and there's a nuclear reactor in there. So you probably want to mount it external to the crew compartment. So if submarines have like a pressure hull that's got people in it, and then you've got bits of the submarine that are outside that pressure hull. So in in naval architecture, you'd say that's external, but they're still often underneath casing. They're sort of covered up. So in layman's terms, they're inside the submarine. They're internal, and that's how I think it will be. They won't be just added on the outside in a sort of a rough and ready way. They'll be inside the casing, but not in the part that is occupied by people.
Nice. So it'd be almost like the Losos or the SDVs where they had large weapons inside.
Yeah, exactly. They'll be, and that's how the Oscar used to carry its missiles anyway. If you look at if you look at Kursk, or there's some great pictures out there, but you've got the bit with people in it, and either side of it you've got these massive banks of missile tubes.
Right, yeah, definitely. They were all externally mounted. You're right.
Yeah, right. So we'd call them external, but if you look at the, in layman's terms, they look like they're inside the submarine. They're covered up and streamlined.
Okay, so in regards to that, so we've only seen a few pictures, right? So with Flota, I don't know if you guys follow him on Twitter. I mean, and I know you guys do. He's amazing. Yeah, so follow at Flota, FOTOFLOTA. He's his name's Oleg. He is he's almost seems like a state photographer because he's just always there. He's the guy that they always bring in to launch submarines at the launching ceremonies.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I think he lives there, and so he gets the really good deals. He's a proper photographer, right? I think he does all sorts of stuff, but he seems to be well connected, and he was the guy who took the pictures. Because they really tried to limit what pictures were being released. We haven't seen anything. Yeah, we've only seen sort of like the very back of the submarine.
Right.
Last 5-10%.
And along those same lines, what about testing? Do we have any independent or third-party reports or verification of testing?
Well, the U.S. Navy and U.S. government say it's been tested. So that's pretty good. And Russian media. And from an open source intelligence perspective, it definitely feels like it's been tested. You can watch this submarine, the test submarine Sarov. It's nearly always in port. And the only time on satellite imagery, we don't have every day, but every time Google Earth updates or one of the other sort of places where you can find free, commercial satellite imagery of the world. Every time it updates that port, it's there in the same place. But the one time it's missing was sort of aligned to a date when it was reported that there was tests.
Do you ever use Sentinel Hub? Do you ever use that? Is it big enough to even see it on there?
I don't use that. Google Earth is the go-to.
Right. Sentinel Hub, though, they have imagery, I think, every week or even more often than that, but it's very low resolution compared to Google Earth.
Yeah. And I mean, Google Earth uses a whole different range of providers, so it varies greatly. But also the Russian one, Yandex, is it? I don't know.
Yandex,
that's brilliant. It's worth checking Bing Maps. It's worth checking. Google Maps versus Google Earth. It's also worth checking whatever Apple's maps are called. Yeah, and TerraServer used to be a good place as well, but I think they're making it harder.
Yep.
And then you've got the ones if you have access to Airbus and so on,
or Planet even. Maybe one day I'll be able to fit that in my budget.
As many as you can, I'd say.
So, anything else on that before we move on?
Eric? I wanted to keep talking about the harpsichord. So I know we hinted on it a little bit, but I was wondering if you could give us like a little explanation in the difference and what you think they're going to be used for.
Yeah. So the harpsichord, and I'm guilty of this. I think I'm probably the person who's made it being called the harpsichord, which is the English term. So the Clavecin, to use the Russian name, is a series of basically unmanned underwater vehicles. They call them autonomous underwater vehicles, so AUV, to sort of use the the non-US. So I mean, most countries use that actually, but it's basically a drone that can do stuff on its own, and is launched in this case from a submarine. Could be from a surface ship as well. They can launch them from surface ships for sure, and it's not. You can tell this by looking at it. Actually, it's got 4 screws or propellers at the back, and lots of holes where there's thrusters inside for sort of like moving it sideways, upwards, downwards. It's designed for maneuverability. It's not designed for cruising, so it's not going to go very far. But it goes up and down pretty well, and it can go very, very deep. So it can go all the way to the sea bed in most of the world. I think they put it at 2,000 meters depth, although which actually isn't all that deep. So I take that back when I say most of the world. But you get some claims that it's deeper, and you can do a lot with it: reconnaissance and seabed mapping. With side-looking scanning sonar and stuff. But potentially they could also manipulate things on the seafloor. I think intelligence is the main thing, though, and that's carried by Belgorod and also by other Russian sort of hosts, or motherships, as you call them. So it's a small yellow object. It's way smaller than Poseidon, and it's not nuclear powered, and it's basically a general purpose unmanned underwater vehicle that can go a lot deeper than the host submarine. So you can use it to sort of go down towards the seafloor. So I don't know what else you want to say about it, but it should be called clavecin, and harpsichord is convenient because that's English, so we can remember that.
Right. So the big difference being maneuverability, right? So, and the Navy has one too that they launch out of the ballistic missile submarines. They use the launch and recovery system. And it's basically this arm that extends out of the missile tube and lays down, and it will launch. I think Lockheed makes I can't remember what it's called right now. I'm missing it right now, but it'll launch their weapon or their UUV, and then it'll go out and do whatever it's supposed to come do, and then it'll actually latch back on with these like 2 arms that grab a rope, and then the rope grabs them in, it grabs the thing, and it pulls it back into the missile tube, and it closes the tube.
I would guess that's how they do it, although in this particular case it might be that it does just under its own power go back down into the hangar that they've got on the back of the submarine. But yeah, exactly. I would expect it can go back. It can come back to the host submarine, which is very advanced capability when you think about it.
Right, and it puts them. It puts it in a weird spot, right? It's almost like a ballistic missile submarine where you don't want to use it for combat, but you got to put it in a real just fickle spot in general, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's actually something we haven't talked about Belgorod in that sense. We talked about Poseidon, but at the same time, it's also a host submarine for deep diving, special mission or underwater engineering submarines. There's one particular one called Losharik, which is a nuclear-powered midget submarine. It's pretty big. It's 70 meters long. So if you saw it at the pier side, you'd think it's a full-size submarine, but inside it's tiny, because it's all these spherical hulls inside a streamlined casing, and because it goes really deep, it can go 1,000 meters, which for a manned submarine is deep, and that's also not built for range. But it's the sort of thing you would want if you were installing or interfering with undersea cables and sensor networks and things like that. So Belgorod and harpsichord or clavecin is connect. It's that sort of mission. So Belgorod has two missions at once. One is about underwater seabed warfare, which is quite a trendy term, but doing espionage stuff on the seafloor, and at the same time it's also carrying these Poseidon doomsday weapons, and there's quite a contradiction between those two missions. It's very hard to know how they're going to actually prioritize or decide what it's doing when, and who's in command of it and stuff like that. There's quite a contradiction, really.
Yeah, it's odd to know that there's still the underwater cable battle going on. People think of it as like an old Cold War thing, but I mean, internet cables they carry the backbone of everything for a country, and if you can tap into that, it can be a game changer.
Well, the bad news is they're much more of an issue for the US and UK and plenty of other countries as well. Russia, because of its geography, is much less bothered, and they're looking at whether they can close off the internet from the rest of the world. And I think it's also got to remember it's not just internet. There's all sorts of other infrastructure under the sea that people are interested in, and in Russia they're particularly interested in stuff under the ice cap, like in the Arctic, and that's where something like Belgorod, I expect it to be operating under the ice cap.
Yeah, definitely. And that was one of the things. You have a really good graphic about how the Belgorod will operate under there, and it's super great. And we're going to put it on the podcast so you guys can see it. But I actually went on the IceX in 2004, and we went under the ice, and man, that's a crazy environment because you can hide in there, and you get into spots where you can't emergency blow because you're just going to blow yourself into the ice, and you're not going to get anywhere. And it's a really, really crazy environment, especially on the fact that we don't normally operate up there. Like when we went up there, our boat was actually stationed out of Norfolk. So when we went up there, our pumps are icing up, and it's just crazy cold out there. And because the water is like 30 degrees, because it's so salty, you can actually go below freezing, normally 32 degrees. So it's, you hit about 29 is when the ice starts to freeze. And we had to dodge icebergs and stuff. It was a really crazy environment.
And it's not flat under there, right? It's got these sort of, trying to think what you call them, but sort of upside down mountains of ice. There is a term, but I don't know how. I'm guessing you couldn't see them. Obviously, you're in a submarine, but you're probably aware that it's pretty dangerous if you're running blind. You don't know what you're going to run into. Big column of ice.
Yeah, we gained a huge appreciation for the sonar techs then, because they kept us alive then. Normally they're just kind of sitting there listening to the shrimp, click 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 or whatever. But at this point they were keeping us from running into icebergs, literally, because we were trying to break through the ice, so you had to find a sweet spot, right? And I forgot what the name of them is, but there's like these pools of water. So when we actually surfaced, we surfaced through a pool. That way we didn't have to try to break it. But yeah, I mean, it's a crazy environment. It's one of those places that you don't normally want to operate in. It was the scariest thing that I ever did personally was operate there, for sure.
Yeah, there's only, I think it's probably true that there's only 3 countries that ever operate there, submarines there, and Russia is one of them. The US does more. I don't know if it does more than Russia, but certainly more than the UK, which is the other one. And the UK occasionally sends a submarine up there. You argue not often enough, but other countries, they just don't do it, and at least not at the moment. So it's a very dangerous environment, and from a Russian perspective, it's their backyard, and they've got a lot of interest in dominating that environment. So Belgorod will be stationed near the Arctic, I think almost certainly. And although it's nuclear powered, so it's got the range to go anywhere it wants, really, but you'd expect it to be operating there under the ice a lot of the time.
Yeah, definitely. Once the ice melts, it's going to be a huge traffic area. It's, people want to control that spot, and who controls that. Especially when you see people like, countries like China where they just literally will build land somewhere and try to take 12 nautical miles each way. It gets a little crazy when it comes to putting up spots, and so you could feasibly do that if you could find the good spot out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's been I don't know how reliable it is, but there's definitely been reports of Russian officials stating more or less that it's their backyard, and that if anyone else wants to operate there, they got to ask permission. By implication, even submarines, which sends a message, doesn't it?
So if I don't know if you have any more questions about those topics, but I think that could be an interesting one. What about China then? So is China really doing anything in the Arctic right now?
Not in terms of submarines. I mean, they're closer to it now than they have been in the past. They're building an icebreaker, and they have sent some ships there recently. I don't remember all the details, but it's been in the news. So yeah, they're looking that way. I think more for trade and things. Their big interest, of course, is South China Sea and the Pacific. Right. But yeah, they're entering that game, but probably not with submarines, I would guess. They have nuclear-powered submarines, so they could if they wanted, but there'd be a steep learning, and you could ask why. Why would they bother?
Well, it seems like China is all up for a lot of that steep learning curves right now. I mean, going from all of a sudden having an aircraft carrier and the third one now planning to be catapult. No more ski jump there. So they're learning quick.
I think all the reports suggest that their submarines are still some way behind, and they also suffer from, operationally, they definitely have been less adventurous than other operators of nuclear submarines. Western operators. So they probably are behind, but it's very dangerous to always assume that they're behind and write them off as copies or, grossly inferior. They should be taken quite seriously, I'd say.
Yeah, I think they're definitely falling into the intermediate stage, because when I was in, there were stories of them where they would broach right next to a battle group. Like they would sneak their way in, and they would be able to get to within visual distance, and they would broach, and all of a sudden they're like, it was literally a guy in the crow's nest. It was just like some old school story, and he was like, "Hey, look, there's a submarine that's broaching out there." The whole group didn't even see it. I mean, submarines are so quiet, and they were quiet enough to sneak up and broach and visually get seen.
Yeah, they've done a few times things like that. The famous one, the one you're referring to, I think I don't know which carrier it was, but it was one of their diesel electric submarines. I think a Song class, but came, broached behind the carrier, didn't it? And that was reported, so I don't know what other ones there have been. But they also sent a submarine through the waterways that go through Japan's series of islands, and there's some international waterways that go through, and they sort of turned up unannounced on the surface, but in a submarine.
So is that a lack of ASW capabilities to be able to detect these things that close to a carrier group or that close to water route?
Yeah.
Or is it just the nature of submarines that they're that stealthy and that hard to detect?
In my opinion, it's so when you get a group out there. So let's say you have a battle group out there, and they're just out there running drills, and they're just kind of out there putting around doing whatever they're supposed to do. They're not on the same state of readiness, right? So if we go to war, the battle group's gonna start just going active everywhere they go, right? But that causes attrition issues, right? So when you have people that are just on watch and they're just at 110% all day every day, it just wears down on your crew. So you try to have a more mellow feel when you're out there, where you're not just running active all the time. You're not just running people into the dirt every time they're on watch, and so that you get a little bit more lax. And so especially with the surface group, they're not generally out there trying to listen for subs, because they're just so hard to hear anyways. And so when they go into a different type of alertness, then they'll just go active all the time, and you generally will find them pretty easy. But if they were just out there, I don't know what they were doing, but they were out there doing like a photo X or something that was just not anywhere near that, and we didn't assume that China could do something like that, especially with the diesel, and then boom, there they are. They just popped up, and I think they popped up because of bad training, because you can broach pretty easy when you're at periscope depth and it's wavy. That wave will suck you right up, and it'll suck the whole boat up, and next thing you know, you're just like boom, right on the surface. Hey, look at me, and then the radars start going off, and boom, you're caught. And so you just emergency deep, and you try to get out of there as fast as you can. And so that's why I think that it's not really a training issue anymore. I think they're getting a lot better at it, because you don't see that anymore. I think that if you're going to see it now, it's going to be more of a, hey, look at my dick kind of a thing, right? It's going to be more of a show of force, right? So, yeah,
agree entirely. And I think that ASW is definitely an area that needs to have more focus, which, that's, people have been saying that for a while. It sort of fell out of, or was underinvested after the Cold War, and it now has to come back.
Yeah,
right. The Taliban does not operate any submarines, do they?
And I think that the navies definitely do that. They got UUV RON 1 right now, so they actually have a group dedicated to UUVs now, which I think is huge. And it's interesting because I was actually talking to Stefan Watkins. He does a lot of OSINT when it comes to tracking naval ships and stuff. And he showed me a NOAA website that shows where NOAA has sent UUVs to track the depth of the ocean. And I was trying to look up the depth of the Black Sea, because everything was going on with the Black Sea when the Russians shot at the Ukrainian ships over there. And you could see where we've sent UUVs into the Black Sea. And I was asking him, and I said, hey, look, like, is a UUV a ship? Because we have rules when it comes to the Black Sea. We can only send in so much stuff. Is a UUV considered a boat, or is it considered a submarine? And he goes, well, I don't know. That's a good question. And you could argue that it's not a submarine because there's no people in it, right? You're just sending a robot, and you're just trying to do research.
Yeah.
So
I think also those UUVs, I think those ones are really small. They probably didn't go through the vast, because the thing about the Black Sea is the waterway through Turkey has certain restrictions on it, and physical restrictions as well as sort of diplomatic, or there's a treaty that says that certain countries can't send submarines except under certain circumstances, which is why the Russian submarines so rarely go, they stay in the Black Sea and they don't go to Syria, and different submarines do the Syria sort of action, and and only when they're finished they then go to the Black Sea for their last time. They can they can't come back. But with a UUV, you could stick it in an aircraft. You can, there's NATO countries bordering the Black Sea, in Turkey as well. There's plenty of ways you could get those vessels in, on board a ship, for example, that goes through. It's just, I think with the UUVs, it's not, I wouldn't say it's not relevant, but it's not that they're contravening any rules in that regard, I don't think. If you have really big ones like the ones that US Navy's now and Royal Navy, hopefully, they've got a request out for them, that might change things, because they'll, depends if they're 20 meters long or whatever, they're going to be difficult to transport, but you still possibly get them there.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to ask you about that. So I think you're referring to the Orca, right? So Boeing's Orca extra large, I think is what they call it, UUV. So what do you think the purpose of this thing is? I don't think we're going to be carrying weapons on it. So what are they going to be doing with it?
I mean, that much is laid out in some publicly available US Navy documents. Not in the first instance, though. When we see photos of it and being built and stuff, it's not a heavily armed system. But ultimately, it would be expected to carry torpedoes and so on. Mines, particularly, I think is a very obvious one. And cruise missiles, Tomahawks or whatever. And yes, so the Orca, the Boeing design, has a sort of payload bay, which I think is optional. I think it's like modular. You can take it out, so it gets longer when you've got the payload bay in there. At least that was for the Echo Voyager, sort of, which was the the prototype, if you like, or demonstrator. So yeah, in the short term, it would probably be doing similar missions to other UUVs, so intelligence related, but it would have the advantage that it could do, visual, optical sort of intelligence, because it could have quite a big mast on it. It's big enough physically, and so you can put a camera above the waves, and so it could do all that stuff. It could also transport things. Theoretically, and this is also a theory, it could carry a number of smaller UUVs for whatever mission, mine countermeasures or laying mines, or gliders for doing sort of those. It could be a mothership for gliders, for example. And then in the long term, they'd implement weapons on it, and but it's still going to be limited compared to a crewed submarine, or a larger submarine is probably a better term. It's less about where it's got people, it's more about how much power it's got on board and things like that, because sensors and things use a lot of energy. But yeah, they're ultimately going to become proper, mature weapon systems similar to manned submarines currently.
Yeah, it seems to me that they're going to try to take over the role of ISR. So, you have an attack submarine where, and so I don't think people understand this, but certain submarines are designed to do certain things, right? We have submarines that are really designed to go out there and battle. We have designs that are designed to be sneaky and quiet, right? So when you go out there and you have a boat designed to do ISR, they'll have periscopes that are designed to look farther and have and have infrared and stuff like that on it and stuff. And so I think what they're trying to do ultimately is trying to unman everything. And so what they want to do is they want to pull that ISR back. And so, hey, instead of driving this attack submarine right up onto, within visual distance, we're going to pull this thing way back, send the UUV in there to do that role, and then just kind of run out.
I think if you there's a few trends that sort of come together, and perhaps by accident, but if you think in the Cold War to a large extent, or beginning Cold War, attack submarines designed to kill other submarines, particularly the nuclear ballistic missile submarines. But somewhere in the Cold War, people figured out you could do a lot of ISR, so a lot of intelligence related stuff with them, and take photographs of missile launches or the underside of interesting warships and things. So particularly the Western, so US Navy and UK Royal Navy. And that would have got quite a lot of attention politically. That's some really sneaky stuff and very cool. I think the most extreme one that's public is the Royal Navy literally using a submarine to steal a towed sonar array from the Russians by cutting it. So this is a towed sonar array designed to detect submarines, and then you use a submarine to drive into it and cut it and steal it in 1982. So that was all very cool, but in the end of the Cold War, that together with special forces delivering special forces became more and more part of the trade, because there wasn't much need to be, or as much need to be, trailing attack, ballistic missile submarines. So things shifted towards ISR and also towards, littoral combat, and launching Tomahawks as well became the done thing. And that's all cool. But now things are switching back, and the Russians have more activity, and so you need your submarines in deeper water again. So it's a shift. The latest or the next generation US Navy and Royal Navy attack submarines are going to probably be more optimized to deeper water operations, so going back to Cold War mode. And at the same time, UUVs come in to then take over those littoral and more risky, closer to the enemy roles. They're more expendable, basically.
Yeah, Cold War too, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about the Navy is they're trying to unman a lot of that stuff, and I'm sure it's just automation. They're just better at doing that stuff than we are, and it's great. But you're starting to see the death of the submariner. I hate to say it, but they're taking our jobs. They're taking the robots. They're taking our jobs, and I think it's great.
You've still got a good 30, 40 years, but that might be for some of the wrong reasons. I mean, because if you're still building manned submarines, they're going to be around for a while. They're expensive.
Yeah, I think you're gonna see them. You're gonna see them roll into this kind of mothership role where they have to have the human aspect, and they're just gonna stay way back and let the robots fight the battles.
Yeah.
So you talked about SDVs, right? So we call them sealed delivery vehicles or special ops, spec ops when it comes to submarines. So one of the things that for all our viewers and people listening that don't know what they do, one of the great things you could do with submarines is you could sneak them right up next to a country, and everybody's done it, right? Even North Korea's done it. Was it South Korea that went into North Korea? I can't remember. One of the ways they invaded each other, they brought a submarine in, they dropped off a special ops group, and then they went on shore, and then they went into the country and did whatever they were supposed to do, right? And so that's one of the great things they do now is they do that. Now, one of the things they have to use, because you don't want to just drive your submarine right up to the shore, which is what the North Koreans did, right? They drove it so close to the shore to drop off their spec ops. They ended up grounding their submarine, and they caught it. So you don't want to do that. You want to have an actual delivery vehicle to get them to a safe spot so you can stay way back. And so I wanted you to kind of talk about those, because I didn't personally deal with anything like that, so I don't know anything about it. But I would like you to kind of maybe explain about SDVs and delivery vehicles and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You probably realize I wrote a book on pretty much on the history of that, because there wasn't a book on that. And so first thing to say, the caveat is that not every country or every unit agrees. There's plenty of variety out there, but the general trend has been more range and more speed, and that's because you want to keep your host submarine or your mother submarine further away from the enemy, exactly as you said. And so a generic top tier SDV, sealed delivery vehicle, or swimmer delivery vehicle, as outside the US. That's what it used to be in the US as well, until someone decided to rename it as a sealed delivery vehicle. They can, they're able to go a pretty good range. Let's say 20, 30 nautical miles, and at probably 8 to 10 knots. 10 knots would be desirable, but 8 knots is probably a lot of them. And a submariner would say that's not far enough. You'd want to do it even further. But there was certainly in the 80s, that was the thing, because a lot of them before the 80s were a lot shorter ranged. And the main limitation is these are mostly wet submarines. So what that means is the crew and the passengers are they're divers. They're wearing breathing apparatus, and they're exposed to the water, and there's going to be a lot of fatigue. Sometimes they can sleep and things, and nowadays you could listen to music or whatever, but it's boring, it's claustrophobic, it's cold. You can only, and there's only so much air supply, so you can't be in this, there's not going to be days. However good technology gets, the human's going to be the limiting factor there. So the good ones, the ones the US and UK and France is back in that game, and Italy and those sorts of countries can carry between 6 and 10 men and or women, 10 people, and they can do it from far enough away that in most cases the submarine's out of harm's way. But there's always this debate. If it really came to a war, would the submarine be made available for the special forces or not? And that's why you get another trend, which is submersible boats, where the special forces are trying to get away from being dependent on the submarine.
So in your opinion, and I know you do a lot of research on all the SDVs and stuff, what is, in your opinion, what do you think is the best operational SDV out there?
Oh, that's a politically difficult question to answer. Clearly the US Navy's shallow water combat submersibles, I think that's the SDV Mark. I think it's the Mark 11 they put to it. That is the most modern one that is both modern technology and combines with the operational capabilities that the US Navy and the Royal Navy are going to put to it there. So carried on a nuclear submarine. The French have a very similar system. It's going to be smaller. They actually have 2 systems, which are sort of comparable. The Italians undoubtedly have a comparable system, but historically you'd say the Italians actually, and this is something it's always interesting because I think people listening, a lot of people might have, a view that aligns to the country they're from. But it's widely said that the Italians actually are probably 10 years ahead of everyone else. I think that might be less the case today due to investment and certain other limitations around the numbers of vehicles. But the Italians have really good swimmer delivery vehicles, and they keep them very secret. And I mean, my website, you can find some information about that, but it's limited. And then there's lots of commercial companies who are also out there. The US one, I mean, there's other US companies that perhaps had better product, arguably. I'm not going to take sides there, but it's very hard to really say that this product is better than the others. The other thing is there's very little information out there, which is why I researched and why I write about them. The history hadn't been written. There's so many vehicles that I probably don't know about, and they're really not well known to, so I might be missing something obvious.
Yeah, they're so interesting because most people think that when it comes to spec ops that, they're just in Afghanistan raiding buildings or whatever. But yeah, they're in the Navy. Like they're actual divers a lot of the times. Like they have to be super wide range when it comes to what they can do.
Yeah, and sometimes in some countries they're in the army even, doing all the same stuff. And you've got quite a lot of special forces units out there. In fact, probably more, I would guess, and I haven't done any real research on this, but you've probably got more than there ever have been before that can legitimately say, they're special forces in some way. But it's coming back into favor. I think Afghanistan and that did reduce the focus on from some Western countries. You've only got so many people, and even though these guys are super soldiers, as it were, they're trained on everything. At the end of the day, you have to prioritize what you're training on, and land warfare has probably taken the focus away. But having said that, I think it's coming back, and I think that it's still it never disappeared completely. So the operational the knowledge is still there, and countries like the obvious countries to name are the US with the US Navy SEALs primarily, the UK with the Special Boat Service, the Italians with their GOI or GOI would be the main unit to say, the French with Commando Herbert, or Herbert to say it in a very English way. They're the big countries to mention. They're in Afghanistan, but they've also got these very advanced swimmer delivery vehicle capabilities. Interestingly, the Russians don't. That's what the interesting bit, I think.
Yeah, definitely, because I wanted to ask you about, because the Italians seem to be really big into the whole spec ops thing, right? And then you look at Russia, and then they're just kind of like, nothing.
The Italians kind of invented it and taught everyone else to some extent in some way.
Oh, okay. So that's interesting. I didn't know that, and I wanted to ask you about the history of it, right? So when last week we talked to Josh Dean, and he explained the whole story about K-129 and that crazy story. And a lot of people don't know about that, and so I was wondering if you could give us a little history and maybe share some what crazy story that most people don't know about.
Well, yeah, it's full of crazy stories, and mostly that people don't know about. I could just say go and buy my book, The Covert Shores, History of Special Forces Missions and Mini-Subs. But it started in about 1917, 1918. And actually, in the final days, so what people don't realize, in the very final days of World War I, 2 Italian naval officers clung to a converted torpedo, and they rowed it into a harbor. They weren't divers. They were sort of swimmers, combat swimmers. They didn't have breathing apparatus, but they crept into a harbor, and they sunk a battleship, a dreadnought battleship. They blew it up by attaching mines to it, which were carried on this vehicle. And because they almost did it, I wouldn't say for the sake of it, but they were desperate to do it because they knew the war was ending and they wanted to go through with their plan that they'd been preparing. But because it's right at the end of World War I, hardly anyone noticed, or rather, all the newspapers, all the history, if you're looking at that sort of like November 1918, it's all about the armistice and the end of the war. So contributed to the fact that only one country really learned the lesson of that. So, so battleships sunk by guys creeping into a harbour, combat swimmers with a vehicle, and the only country that really paid attention was Italy, who'd done it. So in the interwar years, they continued to develop it, and by World War II, they had a very elite frogman unit with, at the time you could say human torpedoes, or Miali, they call them pigs, perhaps because of how bad they handled, but essentially these two-person swimmer delivery vehicle in modern terms. And they used them with good effect, actually. They had a whole range of other vehicles as well, all very interesting, but they sunk 2 British battleships in Alexandria. And the British tried to hide it, but it was devastating. And they kept attacking Gibraltar and things. And then the British copied them and contributed a lot themselves. So by the end of World War II, we could go on lots about other countries and things, but basically the British and the Italians who'd surrendered by that point, but the British and Italians were the masters of this and had an array of vehicles and training. And the British at that time were sort of inventing the modern concept of special forces. And that was passing over to in the US, there was some interest. There was a few vehicles, and they were mostly under the OSS, who had a unit which then got adopted into the UDT, so the Underwater Demolition Team, which were the guys who super brave but not covert. They would swim into, if you think in the Pacific, they would sort of swim up to the coast and try to take blow up all the obstacles that would stop the landing. So they're super brave, but special forces in a sense, but they weren't like the SEALs are. They were sort of one purpose. And but after the war, that changed because they had the OSS, which is now CIA, right? Sort of bloodline in their unit, and they started focusing on swimmer delivery vehicles and technologies and diving. And the French were the guys inventing the diving gear, just so we know. And the French were super involved up from the 1950s. Then the French also joined the game, and the Italians very secretively re-enter, and that's why they're always 10 years ahead. But they share stuff with France and America, and So, and then you have the SEALs being created in the 60s. So that's probably already quite a long history, but it's very there's a lot to it that people don't know, and there's a lot of countries influencing each other, different units. It's not whatever country you're from, reading the history sort of makes you going away saying, there's other countries there too, and we've learned from other countries. It's not. It's probably quite humbling.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting that, Italy out of everybody, because they have some weird rules when it comes to like nuclear power and stuff, but they really do innovate and change the game still. It's even these little countries, they have their little knickknacks here. And even North Korea, right? They have their little Simpo, or supposedly they have a second one that may be in play. This is little single shot SSBN. I mean, they're still changing the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they deserve some credit for it. And Iran particularly, I think, actually, from a purely ability to actually deliver stuff. Not always the best technology, but they deserve some credit. And but yeah, in special forces, swimmer delivery vehicles, things like that. It's the Italians, the French, the British. I mean, just an example, the dry combat submersible. So that's like I said that swimmer delivery vehicles problem is the people. They're going to get cold and tired. There's now a dry combat one, so that's sort of like a mini sub, and that design is British, but Britain doesn't buy it. It's been sold via American companies and with American ownership to the US Navy.
Right, and And I wanted to talk to you specifically about the Losos, so the Russian Piranha, right? And I think it's really interesting because most countries don't give Spec Ops their own submarine, right? They always have a submarine force that will deliver Spec Ops, right? But this is a rare instance where the Navy, I can't think of an instance where the U.S. Navy has actually had a Spec Ops submarine, as far as I know. And so when you see Russia say, hey, look, here's our own cool little submarine for you guys to take out specifically for yourself, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, and I could correct you on the US bit, but it's more or less true. So Russia had quite a few midget submarines. Probably, as far as I can tell, they're probably influenced in the 1950s. They were worrying about British. They kept hearing about the X-craft, which Britain had, and it performed very well in World War II. And that could deliver swimmers and things. So they started building midget submarines. And by the 1980s, they built this one called I'll call it Piranha. And it's titanium hull, so very lightweight hull. It's about 30 meters long. So what's that in feet? 90 foot, say, less than 100 foot probably. And it's unique. It can carry... It's swimmer delivery vehicles, a really horrible type called Sirena. So one that looks like a torpedo, and imagine a torpedo with two guys inside the torpedo. Very uncomfortable, I imagine. And it can carry all sorts of other gear, some torpedoes as well, but just for self-defense. And it's an incredible craft, but it's what's slightly interesting about it is a lot of Russian sources suggest it wasn't successful. It's very unusual for the Russians or any country to sort of admit that their submarines weren't successful. So it's actually a bit dubious. There's a lot of question marks about when it was in service and what it did and whether it was, particularly around Sweden and the incursions that happened in the 1980s. It's too late for most of those, but whether it was used in that manner, it's definitely an interesting submarine.
Yeah, definitely. So, so from what it seems like with any weapon or any type of special ops or any type of operation, it seems like here's what we're going to do. We're going to go blow this thing up. And then we're going to figure out how to use this thing to do more than just blow things up, right? It's nuclear power, SEAL delivery, right? They're just sappers. Essentially, they're just naval sappers. We're going to send them in there underwater, blow up some stuff, and then they figure out, hey, well, we'll put a microphone on there, or we'll do whatever we want, right? And it's really interesting because there's nothing out there. Like, your book is literally one of the only things that I can find that explains anything about it. And most people don't even know that that's what we do. So they saw the recent Hunter Killer, right? So with Gerard Butler, and so now you kind of see it, right? And I'll ask your take on that in a second, but you kind of see that, right? So you kind of see that we're going to send them out there. We use submarines for more than just blowing up stuff with torpedoes, right? So now we're going to take our submarine, instead of blowing stuff up, we're going to send them close and we're going to spy on people or whatever, right? Yeah, so I don't know if you actually saw Hunter Killer. I have my own opinion on it. It's a little Hollywood, but you have a special take when it comes to the actual Spec Ops delivery part. I don't know if you've seen the movie, but if you have, what do you think about it?
I haven't, actually. And if it sounds bad, I wasn't particularly waiting to. the trailer was enough for me. But I think from what I've seen or what I've heard, they deliver some SEALs to rescue the Russian president from the pier side or something. Is that right, or am I?
Yeah, definitely. And then they kind of swim up and go in there in an SDV.
Yeah. So these midget subs are sort of the SEAL delivery vehicle. You can fit, let's say, 10 people onto them. Typically, you normally need a lot of training on escape. You can put a price on this. They're expensive, and part of the reason is because the guys who are being passengers on them, at least in the Western, in a professional context, they need a lot of training just on safety and escape, and it's claustrophobic and scary and stuff. And I think you could put people on there who haven't been trained, especially in an evacuation context. And there's certain things around the breathing apparatus you'd do, and you'd use a full face mask and tension. This is a controversial suggestion, but you might want to put them to, make them asleep, not in a dead way, but literally in a sleep, and stuff, which is definitely dangerous. So they can be used for rescuing people, and they can be used for inserting people, and they have been, no doubt. But it's a very inconvenient way to travel. It's covert. That's what's so special about it. It's a very difficult evolutionary training operation to enter and exit and things. And different countries do disagree on, or have different procedures, but you have to in most Western countries, I think, certainly US, you'd have to wear fins. So what should we? I'm trying to think what the popular word would be, but the flippers you wear on your feet, you have to wear those so that you can escape if something goes wrong. And people have died in training. Really super experienced people do die in training in these. So it's so I don't. In that circumstance, maybe you'd use it, but I wonder if it's a Hollywood device a little bit.
Yeah, it's one of those things where they don't really know what to do with it, but they try their best. And I give them
ruining films for people.
Oh no, it's cool. And I did the same thing when it came to the submarine part. I gave them a high five. It is what it is. They did their best, and they gotta work. They gotta make money. Hollywood's got a Hollywood. You know what I mean?
There's another film they could have made which I would have wanted to see, but I would be it's a small audience, isn't it? And yeah. There's at the same time, actually, there was a book, and this is something that is cool. Have you guys heard of Larry Bond and Chris Carlson?
Oh yeah.
No, I have not.
Oh, okay. These are techno thriller, often but not always submarine centric techno thriller guys who have been associated. I think Larry Bond was associated with Tom Clancy, so it's very much nature. And they released a book called Arctic Gambit about the same time the film came out, coincidentally, and it's a submarine book, and it's fiction, and for sure, and there's some bits of it that you could say, well, it's not realistic, and I think they probably know that. There's no doubt they know their stuff, but it's interesting, the differences, and Eric, you probably, I don't know if you've already observed this, but in the film, you've got the scene where they fire a torpedo and they say fire, and that's probably not a word you'd use on the submarine, right?
Yeah, I actually called out Hunter Killer on that, because that was their whole big advertisement. Was he goes fire, and I'm like, oh my god, the control room's on fire, Yeah, if anybody who doesn't know, you don't say fire on a naval ship because people will hear that in another room and assume there's a fire. So you say shoot a tube, or you shoot a weapon. You don't fire anything.
And that book, Arctic Gambit, is worth looking up. I did a brief review on it, actually. It's worth looking up. It's got a Poseidon in it, or a version of Poseidon, and the latest submarines. And yeah, it says shoot. And that's sort of the mark. You can almost sum it up in that one small feature. The book I would recommend. It's interesting, and it's got some thought-provoking, some connection to the real world, and then the film, it's Hollywood. But that's what they were after. I mean, I don't think there's any, I shouldn't knock it too much. I don't think there's any, apologies for that. And I haven't seen it, but isn't there a even worse one that's come out very recently with, is it Jean-Claude Van Damme or Steven Seagal or someone,
Oh, we talked about that on another podcast. Yeah, I forgot the name.
And that's further down the list.
Eric, was that you?
Oh, yeah. No, this is where we need Kyle, because Kyle does a submersion podcast where he does just submarine movies, and he's not here tonight. But yeah, it was. I've watched it. It's a really ridiculous movie, because if you watch it, they end up in rooms, and they're just like drywalled rooms. So they did two things. One was they recorded it on it looks like a surface ship. historical museum ship. And so you could see where they like dog down the doors and stuff, which is not anything you have on submarines. And then what they did was when it came to the actual interior part of the movie, they just put them in dried-walled rooms and they just painted the rooms black. So it's just a square room. They didn't even like put rivets or anything stupid, stereotypically submarine in there. It's just a drywalled room with a door. It looks like a shield show or something. Like they're trying to interrogate him for NCIS or something. It's crazy. They spent everything they could on Dolph Lundgren and Jean-Claude Van Damme, which is great. They're great actors, but you gotta spend some money on the set and at least try, especially when it comes to like, in the UK you have, we have 2 Foxtrot submarines, right? So you have the one in San Diego at the Maritime Museum, and then you have the one that's owned by John Sutton. And so it's great. You should go out there. You should go out there and record your movie on that thing. He actually has somebody out there this week actually recording another movie. They record a lot of movies out there now. But yeah, it's a Russian submarine that you can go down there and record. You don't need to put it in a drywall room. Like, don't be lazy. Like you gotta at least try a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. You can, and they mock up submarine. I mean, there's lots of, probably less so nowadays, but there's plenty of legitimate mocking up of submarines in plywood and stuff, and I think film crews can, the guys who build props could do that easily. They could, that's lazy.
Yeah, and that's the problem. When you're filming stuff, if you're on an actual submarine, it can be real difficult to record sound properly, get camera angles and all that, because it's not very, submarines are not known to be the most spacious areas. But still, a mock-up, yeah, you can do something. At least have the walls curved a little bit or something. But
yeah, and then Intelopus and I don't know if you guys follow him on Twitter, but at Intelopus, he's an Intel guy. Him and I went down to Groton, and we went to the commissioning of the USS South Dakota. And when we went down before that, they had this big rack, and you had to put your cell phone in it. Like, you can't take pictures down there. We're gonna give you a quick tour. You're gonna get in and out, And so it's even if you do get the chance to go down there and record, like, it is heavily restricted, and you better be sure that they're going to go through all your stuff and cut out whatever they don't want you to have.
Yeah. But there's, as you say, there's loads of museum ships, and some of them might be very dated and that, but they're still better than a drywall room. There's one. I don't know if you might know about this, but there's a UK TV drama series coming out, and I think it should already be out, but I suspect it's not. I haven't heard about it, but set on a submarine. At least I hope they are, because they briefly talked to me when they were researching it. It sounds very cool, but I've lost. I'd have to. It's a note to myself. I'll have to find out if that's coming out. But that sounded. At least they were listening to people, so it sounds like it's going to be probably more realistic. You'd hope.
Yeah, and I heard that Das Boot just came out recently somewhere over in Europe somewhere. We generally don't get stuff like that over here, but
oh yes, I did see. I don't know if it's come out, but I saw. If it has, I'll look it up. Das Boot is my number one. The original is my number one submarine movie, I'd say.
I've still not seen that movie yet.
Oh, that's a crime.
Yeah, I have to get around to it. It's in German though, right? The whole thing, you have to read the subtitles.
Yeah, but you can watch it with subtitles. It's brilliant. There's certain bits that show its age, special effects and things and that. But overall, it's I would guess it's well, I know there's plenty of people in the submarine world who rate it number one. One interesting story, and to go back to sort of unknown history. So in the so I'm going to piece things together. So I've been told some of this history by a retired US Navy SEAL officer who was involved. But I've also had to sort of piece some of it. He wouldn't tell me everything, and I had to piece things together. But basically, in the 1990s, you remember there was this Persian Gulf War between Iran and Iraq, and the US Navy was quite involved. And you guys remember that, or?
Oh yeah, definitely. I was a little young then, but yeah, I remember.
Unhelpfully, I knew it as the Gulf War, and that got very confusing. because then the other Gulf War came along, right? And but there was some lots going on at the time, and Iran had some at-sea bases. Like, I don't know exactly. I think they were converted oil rigs or something of that nature.
Yeah.
And the U.S. Navy SEALs were going to raid them, and what they did was they got SDV Mark 8. So this is sort of six or 8 man, well, 6 man at SDV at the time, and they were carrying big mine, like huge limpet mines in them. And they called their unit, like the exercise, the operation, they called it, I can't remember exactly what they called it, but it was basically Das Boot. They were so influenced by that movie. They were so into that movie that they called, they used the term for their own little exercises, practicing blowing up oil rigs. And then when it came to the real operation, they didn't actually use the SDVs. They went in by, I think, helicopter, but you can find it out. There's plenty of well documented.
You're talking about Operation Praying Mantis, right?
Yes, that's right.
1988. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I should have an internet in front of me, then I'd sound a bit more knowledgeable. But I should know that. Yeah. But yeah, there was a serious thought to do it with SDVs, or people preparing for it. I mean, I haven't got all the details, unfortunately, but in fact, I'm only guessing that that's exactly what it was, but it's a safe bet.
I didn't know that. Yeah, that Operation Praying Mantis is pretty interesting. I've talked about it a lot and done some research into it. I didn't know that part, but just the history of using like the harpoon. There was a bunch of weapons used for the first time or extensively in that. The harpoon, the standard missiles, stuff like that. But
yeah, and standard missiles against surface ships. Huh?
Yeah, the little 62-pound warhead on it. Yeah. Yeah,
there's been a few things like that. And then the SDVs did go to Desert Storm. Is that how it's known in US? I'm not sure.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, we call it deserts. Yeah.
So Desert Storm, but yes, exactly, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War.
Right. We don't even call the second one the second Gulf War. Usually, I think they just say 2003 invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, exactly. It's that's why I'm confused, because we've just been talking about the 1980s Gulf War and then the 1990 Gulf War. But they did use SDVs there, but mostly for recce. And again, I think if anything, it was missed opportunities. They could have used SDVs more aggressively. Let's say that would be a sentiment that people shared. But they had SDVs there, and again, hardly anyone knows that, right? It's not. There are photos available, and again, I write about it in my book, but how many people know that? It didn't. Yeah.
No, I did not. So, well, that's the whole point of them too, right? Keep them secret.
Yeah, but they carried them on a Kuwaiti missile boat, and they used that as a mother, and they towed it. So another thing, so you mentioned SDVs being carried by submarines, and that's a very covert way of delivering them. Some of them can be, the US Navy ones, for example, can be towed behind a surface ship, and sometimes incredible speeds, like 30 knots. They've got this cradle that they can be towed.
Underwater? Are they towed underwater or just
on the surface? Although for sure there's been other things about towing them underwater. That's also possible. That was very much the East German method, actually, because they didn't have any submarines.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good segue then. One thing I'm really interested in, really want to ask you about, is your artwork, the artwork stuff you do. So all the stuff you do yourself, right?
Nearly all, yeah. So I mean, I credit when I don't. So I sometimes use other people's pictures, but with the appropriate credit when necessary and stuff. But yeah, if you've been on my website, you've seen my pictures basically. All the sort of profiles and 3D, often cutaways. I like drawing them. Yeah, I draw submarines. One obvious reason is because that allows me to show submarines that you can't get good photos of, or not complete photos, and show what's beneath the waterline, and show them from different angles and so on. Photographs are really limited.
Oh yeah,
for the most part.
So you were telling us before we started that you use Paint, Microsoft Paint, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's incredible.
Well, I also use GIMP, which is a free open source sort of editing tool, but I draw them in Paint. And I think I've got on my website, I've got a few examples, some pages that show how I do that, to prove I'm not lying. And because you wouldn't believe it really if you saw it. And there's a few reasons. There's quite a few reasons. One is that I've been doing Paint since, I think I'm going to say, maybe 1980s.
Yeah. Well, if you're most comfortable
if they
with
called
it,
it
then
Paint at the time, I don't know. Sorry?
Yeah, if that's what you're most comfortable with and you know how to use it effectively, then yeah, by all means.
I'd say if you, I guess I could say I can draw. So if you can draw, then it's less important what tool you're using. So I literally draw from scratch these things, and I've developed a few tricks, a few lazy tricks. I've sort of dispensed with perspective on some of my cutaways because it's just easier to cut and paste and move things around if they're in the wrong place. But I'm doing stuff by eye, and it's which is why some of them don't look so great. If I'm honest, it causes problems. But yeah, I draw them in MS Paint and then I render them in another tool. I also do it. A good reason is because I want to keep the same art style, because if I put them together into a book or whatever, I want them to all look together. And if I switch tools now, then I suddenly have to disconnect. Secondly, because I rejoice in people lecturing me on, people who I guess mostly aren't artists, lecturing me on, what I'm doing wrong using Paint. Which is just, yeah.
So I've done some 3D modeling. I don't know if you ever use any of that stuff with that 3ds Max or even a little bit of Blender.
Yeah, I should admit that I am actually fluent in other tools and CAD and 3D modeling. I'm not very current. I've let it lapse, but yeah, I could do all that stuff.
Okay. But the hardest thing would be scale. If you're doing it in Paint, how do you maintain scale? I know you were saying with perspective images, it's obviously much more difficult. But for scale, how do you do that? Is it just kind of by eye, you were saying?
Mostly. So what I typically do is and this varies greatly, but I get a side profile, ideally a schematic, and often they are off the internet. But for Belgorod, so if you go on my website, you'll find Belgorod picture. In fact, if you just Google Belgorod submarine and you see a submarine with a yellow object on its back and it's got cut away, that's by me. Been stolen by many people, but it's by me.
Yeah, if you go to the Daily Mail, I don't know if we can mention it, but should we talk about it?
Can do, yeah.
Daily Mail, right? UK. I saw your Twitter post.
One of the UK's more notorious tabloids. So, they were comically labelled fake news by some algorithm, which actually sounds about right. They have a mixed. I don't want to be too harsh to the journalists. I don't know how people become journalists for them, but they don't really focus on accuracy, and which is a worry, because if they're using my images, which they do, I would, for me, quite frequently, probably insignificant from their perspective, but they're not helping my credibility.
Yeah, that too. It looks like you endorse it in a way, yeah.
So there's other people have done the same, but they ripped off my Belgorod picture. I've tried to work out which version. I think they might have ripped it off via someone else, but they didn't give credit or any money either. I wasn't really expecting money, but credit would be nice. A link would be nice.
Because you make money off these sometime, right? So you actually do make money off some of your drawings, or am I wrong?
I do commissions for some people, for magazines and things, Jane's. But in most cases, I'm, if people give me credit, a link is nice, then and do it openly and tell me about it, then that's cool. I don't mind people sharing them really, but I do have copyright, and but I don't think there's no hope of Daily Mail ever answering an email or being held accountable for stealing people's pictures. They do it all the time, I think, and I think all media does. But But the other one is, so the Daily Mail, I didn't like them doing it partly because I didn't agree with a lot. I sort of care about what's being said about Belgorod, and I didn't want to be associated with what they write. But also the Russian state media also ripped off the same picture, which is slightly funny because it's not the first time it's happened, but the state media is, or any of the media in Russia, which is pretty much all state, it seems, in some way, is a source for open source intelligence. And you have to read it very carefully. And there's a lot of rubbish being posted about stuff. And they cite an unnamed official. And it's basically, I don't know if they are being told it or whether they're making it up. I don't know. But sometimes they have very good information in there. And but you've got to be careful because often that information is coming from me. So it's a circular reference. I could easily read specs and whatever and go, oh, yes, that confirms what I said. It's like, actually, there's cases where I can figure out that they got that from me because they wouldn't have put that decimal there. They would have put it, this or that, and they're using my drawings. So circular reference. So don't take the official Russian view as an official picture because it's not. It's drawn by me. And they've done a better one was a shipyard. In fact, the shipyard. No, it wasn't the one that's built Belgorod. It's the other one. But a shipyard in the same city in Russia, which is involved in nuclear submarine building. They and this is really good open source sort of a source for open source intelligence. When they're launching ships, they have these commemorative. They're like little flags. Actually, they're pendants. It's the typical thing in Russia. And they put a picture of the submarine on it and some hints around its role and things. But they're usually somewhat censored, let's say. But it's a useful source of intelligence. And they were going to relaunch. It was actually after maintenance, but they're relaunching a very secretive deep sea submarine, an X-ray class boat or Paltus class to Western intelligence. And they had a picture of the submarine on it. And that would be brilliant. That's like a real intelligence coup if you get that picture and you know what it looks like. But it was the wrong submarine. And we know it's the wrong submarine because I drew it and they'd stolen my picture of the internet. And they hadn't, if they'd asked, I had their submarine. If they'd bought my book, they could have used the right picture, but they used a picture of a similar one. And they also edited it. And I know they edited it wrong, but they censored my drawing of their submarine and used it on their official pendants. So you'd think they'd have a better picture themselves, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's funny. So you might be looking at this and trying to find more information after you wrote about it, and you see that the numbers are right. You're like, oh, I'm right. But then you find out that, no, they just copied you. Wow.
The easy bit is I know where I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So I'm like, they're definitely wrong. If they're right, they're wrong. Yeah, so don't believe the specs or basically don't believe anything that Russian media puts out about Belgorod, except for that guy, Oleg, you mentioned, that photographer. I mean, his photographs are amazing, brilliant. Yes, they don't tell you very much. I'm sure he following some instructions, but that's what he's allowed to take pictures of and stuff. And that's interesting because he took pictures of the back of a submarine with its screws, and not very well. Yeah. And that's normally the bit that's most hidden, and that's right. The bit they let you see. So that tells you how special this boat is.
I was asking Eric about that. Maybe Eric can go into more details on it. But yeah, the U.S., you will almost never find a picture of Los Angeles or Virginia or Ohio class screws. They always have them covered up or something. I think there were a few pictures of a boat passing by, and then I think there was a bird's eye view of an aerial photography aircraft on Bing or something like that happened to get, I think it was in up near Seattle, up at the naval base up there. But besides that, they usually never show these things.
Yeah, so screws are funny because one of the things you got to realize is when you can see them from satellites now. So if you were to park your submarine in really clear water, like let's say you pull into Okinawa, well, that water is like super duper clear. You can stand next to the pier and see the screw. I mean, it's not anything secret. It's really getting that pitch, and it's looking at the little details on the screw that makes a big difference, right? And the other thing is once they put, let's say they post these photos, right? Let's say they didn't have, because in this photo that Oleg took, they had the screws covered, right? And you could tell that they probably put some kind of cover over it to show that there's maybe some kind of shroud around the prop or something. I don't know, but it could just be part of the cloth. I mean, who knows, right? And so with those little things, you got to understand that stuff can get changed. You know, once they put the boat in the water, they can pull the screw off and put a new screw on. I mean, it's not anything super secret anymore. I mean, it is. They, in a lot of countries, especially the countries that are newer to the game, will play that because they have to hide that. They don't really have a choice. But I mean, we know what they sound like. We know everything about them. Like that's really just kind of a game at this point.
I think on her screws, I mean, they're the same as on the Oscar, and they've got the smaller blades after the main screw. So they're old-fashioned in a way. I mean, at the time they were super modern, and they're still quiet. They're not to be rubbished, but I reckon we know exactly what their screws look like, and but not any chips on it. Yeah, that's the stuff that's going to make it unique at some point in the future. Any damage or anything, but in the 60s and 70s, this really was secret stuff, and so some of what we're, this idea that the screws are so secret is carry over from the Cold War when there were real changes being made. Well, firstly, US and UK. Actually, it's one area where the US has benefited from the UK quite heavily, actually. But the drive was to make submarines quieter, and in Russia they didn't really know, or they didn't really understand that until the Walker spy ring thing, when they learned the hard way that actually their submarines could really be tracked worse than they thought they could. But so there was some real effort to keep that stuff secret, and then you got these pump jet propulsors and stuff like that coming out. And it's still it's treated, like in the UK particularly, it was treated really sensitively up, and then somewhere around the Astute time they suddenly gave up. It's like, this is silly. Everyone should know we've got pulse to it. Because in American, or pump jet is probably an easier term, but these sorts of shrouded jet-like props that go on the back of the latest US Navy submarines, those were developed in the UK originally. That technology comes from there. So they've been having but in any Cold War images of UK submarines, it was all hidden. There was it was sort of a rumor in the 80s.
And excuse my ignorance, but those are obviously then to reduce sound?
Yes, but they perform differently from screws. So it depends on. They're very relevant for nuclear submarines because they're at high speed. So they're quieter at higher speeds.
Okay.
And I'm sure there's more to it. Someone who knows about it could,
I'll raise my hand. I think I can throw in here a little bit. So when it comes to the pump jet, the big thing is with nuclear powered submarines, you have unlimited power, right? The pump jets get really inefficient at low speeds. So if you're trying to creep and you're trying to do ISR, or you're trying to go 5 knots to nowhere, or whatever you're doing, that pump jet, it holds that little bit of water that you're trying to pump out. And so it becomes really, really inefficient. And it'll make you more secret, like it'll hold the sound and it'll hold the cavitation down, but it's ultimately really bad. And if you don't have a nuclear powered submarine, you're running on AIP or you're running on diesel or whatever it is, it will destroy your batteries. I mean, it just kills your batteries. So it's not worth having them unless they're going to be on nuclear powered submarines. And generally you want to have them because they'll give you more efficiency at high speeds. So you want to have that nuclear power. You want to have that blue water capability, right? Generally diesel submarines are just creeping around, not doing nothing.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I wasn't sure how to say that, but yeah. But that's exactly why you don't see diesel electric submarines with them. You see some with something called a cork nozzle, so like with a shroud, but it's not tight fitting. And but one interesting thing, I don't know the full story, but for sure there are people in the 1940s and 50s looking at pump jets and assuming that submarines going to have pump jets. And the Russians even developed one, an experimental boat with one, but I don't think it ever went to sea with a pump jet, and then it blew up before before they ever fitted it, I think, but in the 50s. So it's not all that a new idea.
But yeah, definitely. All right, man. I think this was a great interview. Do you have anything else, Greg, you wanna cover for this one?
The only other thing I can think of is maybe I think you wanted to touch on the narco subs. Did you have a few questions about that?
Well, yeah, definitely, and I think that we're almost hitting 2 hours now, so I think I wanna save that for a second podcast because he's got some great research going on, and I want to go ahead and let him finish on what he's doing, and then whenever he finishes, we'll have him on the podcast and we'll talk about it because I think it's great. I think there's a huge amount of misinformation and people don't understand what's going on with the narco subs, and even the name narco subs is kind of a misnomer. So yeah, I definitely want to talk to him about it, but I want to go ahead and let him finish what he's got going on and then have him on when he's done.
Sounds good. Yeah, be a lot better podcast then. Yeah, a lot more information.
Yeah, sounds cool. But would love to.
Yeah. All right. Well, I had fun just being able to sit here and listen. I think half the podcast I didn't talk, but it was fun just sitting here listening and learning all this stuff. It was awesome. Thank you so much for being on. It was really incredible.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, guys.
Yeah, man, and I know I can speak for everybody in the community, the submarine community. We've been super excited to hear from you. So I am deeply satisfied and happy and glad that you could show up. And I'm hoping for a second one where we could talk about narco subs because I think it's really interesting, and I think we definitely need to hit on it sometime. So thank you very much, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Tech Ops is owned and operated by hosts Eric M. and Greg R., along with producer Kyle Smith. Copyright 2019. Music by Kevin MacLeod, Twisted. Creative Commons 3.0.